Research on Equal Opportunity. And thanks for joining us again at the penultimate day of Agenda 2025, our conference where we are trying to develop the equal opportunity free enterprise agenda for the president who's inaugurated in January of 2025. Why not 2021? Well, it takes 4 years to really recalibrate the way the Republican and Democratic parties operate on some of these issues and build bridges where they need to be built. And that's what we are going to be working on today. And one of the most important issues there is, both for the economy and the world, and that is energy policy. We're joined today by three very important players and thought leaders in the energy and climate debates, starting with our own Robert Bryce, visiting fellow in energy policy here at FREOPP. We're also joined by my old friend Neil Chatterjee, who is at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, was commissioner for most of the last several years, but was just recently demoted for reasons he can get into. Now he's just a plain old member of the commission. And we're also joined by Niko McMurray of ClearPath, who is an expert on nuclear energy. And there's a lot going on in nuclear energy that we are going to be able to talk about today. I'm really excited to have Niko here to tell us about. All right, so let's start with Robert. Robert, since your role in a sense is and you've written so many books about energy on a very kind of macro or global basis, getting into the details, of course, but really helping all of us think better about what we use energy for, why it's needed, and why certain approaches to reducing carbon emissions, as important as it is to reduce carbon emissions and to fight climate change, certain approaches to reducing carbon emissions won't work. So give us the lay of the land, Robert. What do we need to do if we want to be responsible with our energy supply, while also making sure that energy is abundant and affordable, particularly for lower income Americans who, when you restrict the supply of energy and make it more expensive, they're the ones who get hammered.
Sure, and I think that that's the key challenge. And the President-elect Biden has made a lot of pronouncements about what his plans are, but I think that that's really going to be the key challenge: is how do they balance the desire to reduce CO2 emissions while keeping costs in line? Because energy poverty is real in America. Something like 14 or 15% of Americans live in energy poverty. And we are seeing that particularly in California, where you have the highest poverty rate in America. And yet 39 communities in California have already implemented natural gas bans, which are in fact really a regressive tax on the poor. But I think it's also clear that natural gas has to be part of the mix. And despite these efforts to ban it, and this is something that is happening at both the local, state, and national, there's national discussions about this as well, but natural gas has been key in keeping prices down. Last October, a year ago, the White House Council on Economic Advisors estimated that the shale revolution is now saving U.S. consumers about $200 billion a year, $2,500 for a family of four. And here's the key part: nearly 80% of the total savings stem from substantially lower prices for natural gas, which more than half comes from lower electricity prices. So cheaper gas has led to cheaper electricity, and it's clear that expensive energy is bad for the poor and the middle class. But I think the other big challenge here is to what extent the incoming Democrats are going to push for major decarbonization efforts in the electric grid, because it is such a big challenge. And I published a piece in Forbes a few weeks ago pointing out that we're now using coal and natural gas to produce about 2,700 terawatt hours of electricity per year. Well, if that's an enormous quantity of electricity. It's roughly equal to the output of all global nuclear. So I think that it's clear that the challenge here is going to be reaching a balance between renewables, which are clearly growing. I have solar panels on the roof of my house. Wind energy is growing, but as you add more solar and wind, we have seen, particularly in California, prices rise dramatically. So, and nuclear, I'm bullish on nuclear, I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but the ability of nuclear plants to stay open is being challenged now. We've seen them close in California. Seeing them close in New York, and I'll leave it to Niko to talk more about that. But I think that's striking that balance is really going to be the challenge for not just the next 4 years, but the next 1 or 2 decades.
What percentage of American energy comes from these different sources? Coal, gas, oil, crude oil, wind, solar, nuclear.
Well, it depends. In transportation, we're almost 90, 95, well, more than 95, 96, 98% of our transportation is fueled with oil. But the battle really, Avik, I see the battle lines, political lines being drawn around the electric grid because there's a push to electrify everything. So if you look at the electric grid now, we're getting low single digits in renewables, that's solar and wind, or maybe even low double digits, 20% roughly from nuclear, about 40 or 45% from natural gas, and the balance from nuclear. And I mentioned nuclear already, from coal and hydro. So those are the basic breakdowns in terms of electricity. And again, I think that's where, I mean, make no mistake, there are tens of billions of dollars at stake here, and a lot of political pressure to use more renewables throughout the country. So, but that's the basic breakdown.
This whole thing about how the places that are banning natural gas or banning unconventional exploration, hydraulic fracturing or fracking, are also the places that are closing down their nuclear power plants, which is the most reliable source of low carbon abundant energy. I just don't understand that. Niko, please explain to us what is going on with nuclear energy.
Yeah, so a great question. Thank you for having me on today. It's really important. I mean, our existing fleet, our 94 reactors, provide over half of our low carbon electricity here in the US. I mean, that is really saying something. Just those 94 units can provide that much electricity, but they are challenged right now with, natural gas prices being so low, subsidized renewables. So the challenge is how to keep them open. And the industry is really focused on lowering those operating costs to try to be more cost competitive. There has been discussion and bipartisan support for nuclear, especially on a recent bill that was introduced this week that would support the existing fleet. And then there's also the question of what's next. So a lot of these plants are going for license renewal. Most have been relicensed from 40 to 60 years. Some are starting to be relicensed from 60 to 80 years. So that is one option to continue the life of these reactors. But then in order to eventually replace them when they shut down, also to support more low carbon electricity going onto the grid. And then what I think is also really exciting is some of these new technologies, advanced reactors, as I'll kind of colloquially call them, they have high temperature properties, could be used for process heat. So how can they provide process heat for industrial facilities? How can they provide process heat for hydrogen generation to be more efficient? So I think there's a lot of areas in nuclear that are changing from what we kind of know and have operating in the US. And it's exciting to see some of these new companies and private companies really starting up and trying to build these designs, not just domestically, but also internationally.
Explain what process heat is.
So if you're looking for, as Robert mentioned, so use oil for gasoline for transportation. For a lot of your heavy industry, you're really burning natural gas to get those high temperature heat for, say, steel, fertilizer, other kind of processes, chemical processes that require high temperatures to work. So cement production, some of those are very high temperatures. So our existing fleet doesn't really have the temperatures that can actually be used to support some of these processes. But some of these advanced reactors, because they operate in the 700 degrees C plus range, they can actually be used for providing the heat instead of burning natural gas. So it provides another way of decarbonizing different sectors in the US that are not just electricity.
Now, one of the things could I jump
in?
Please do, Robert.
I think one of the things that to me is concerning, and Niko mentioned this, that we're seeing these nuclear plants close, and when they close, they're being replaced by natural gas fired. We've seen it now again in New York with the closure of Unit 2 at Indian Point. So I'm adamantly pro natural gas, but I'm concerned that we're becoming too dependent on it. That we've seen our natural gas consumption just in the electric grid double in the last 19 years. So I'm pro natural gas. I'm pro nuclear, but I think that I think we need to see nuclear take a bigger piece of the pie if it's possible.
So just to reiterate that point, Robert, what you're saying is that despite the fact that wind and solar have grown a lot in the last 10 years, natural gas output has actually doubled to meet both the growing energy demands of the country, but also the transitions away from coal and nuclear energy. Is that the right way to think about it?
Well, I think where natural gas has really gained in the electric grid has been at the expense of coal. I mean, that's clearly the case. And that's one of the reasons why the U.S. has reduced its CO2 emissions more than any other country on an absolute basis over the last few
Because just for
years.
the people who aren't familiar with it, because coal has much more carbon emission per unit of energy than
Roughly
natural gas. Is that
double.
right?
The
Yeah.
combustion of coal emits roughly twice as much CO2 per kilowatt hour as burning natural gas. So that supplanting of coal by the natural gas sector has resulted in huge CO2 emissions reductions, and really without any federal mandates to do so. It's really been there's been political risk, of course, and some and federal requirements and so on, but this has largely been a market-driven change.
So yeah, this is also a remarkable thing that the United States has not been a signatory to these various international climate agreements, and yet the U.S. has performed better, I believe, than any other large country in terms of reductions in carbon emissions. Is that all about the coal to natural gas story? And if so, why isn't that happening elsewhere? Why aren't we seeing the same trends in Europe and other places?
Well, it's because, as I say this with seriously, it's we have the shale, we have the rigs, the rednecks, and the rights. With the U.S. is uniquely blessed when it comes to natural gas deposits, natural gas resources. We've seen our natural gas production in the U.S. Roughly double since 2005. We were going to be a prospective LNG importer of over 20 billion cubic feet per day in the late 2010s. By the end of next year, the U.S. will be exporting roughly 10 billion cubic feet per day. So that's a swing of 30 billion cubic feet per day in the global LNG market, which is really unprecedented. And what we've seen in gas production in the U.S. hasn't happened anywhere else in the rest of the world. And it's partly a story of mineral rights, partly a story of a very mature drilling sector, but also we have an amazing and extensive natural gas grid.
While we're waiting for Neil Chatterjee to join us, he's apparently having some challenges logging in with his phone. And a reminder to the audience that if you want to ask a question to our panelists, push the Q&A button on your Zoom window or tweet us at #Agenda 2025. This is going back to Niko. One of the things that I've heard you say, Robert, in the past is, in the short term, we've got to use natural gas. If we want to reduce carbon emissions, that coal to gas transition is really important because that's the near-term way to reduce carbon emissions in a way that involves low-cost, abundant energy. Nuclear energy is, of course, also abundant, but there's this enormous red tape involved in approving nuclear plants. It also takes time to build them. They're expensive. What I'd love to understand from you, Niko, is how much of that red tape is amenable to policy? Like, how much of it is just it takes time to build these plants, and even with the advanced technologies, it takes time to pilot them, and how much of it is just plain old red tape, plain old political hesitation, things like that? In other words, if we were really just thinking purely scientifically and being true to the science and saying, you know what, nuclear really works. Nuclear is the way to reduce carbon emissions and provide abundant energy. The politics aren't important. What kind of policy regime would we have? What would the Nuclear Regulatory Commission be doing differently than it does today? You used to work at the NRC, so I assume you have some insights into this.
Yeah, before getting to that, great questions. I want to go back to something Robert mentioned real quick, switching from natural gas and how it's really taken off. That was really due because it was a superior technology market opportunity. And I think that's really where a lot of these new reactor companies are trying to think of it, is how can we make our design cost competitive to natural gas being the cheapest option here in the US? And then how can we scale up so we can really build quickly and rapidly and deploy? So all of those things you mentioned are really the questions that these dozens of advanced reactor companies here in the US are thinking of. They know they need to be cost competitive, or they're not going to be an option for a utility or private equity. They're not going to have interest. So they're really looking at it from, all right, how do we start from, blank sheet approach to saying, what can we really cut out? What is important from, production and working? What is important for safety to answer the questions from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? Then what do the utilities need? What does the market need? What does the market want? And trying to adjust their design to fit within those needs. So the Department of Energy, a lot of resources there, national labs, a lot of resources there, leveraging a lot of those resources for this next generation. There has been a lot of bipartisan policy support, as I mentioned before, on significant pieces of legislation, both on research and development, deployment, and actually demonstrating some of these units, which we can talk about later, and on the regulatory side, where the NRC is taking steps to consider how to license these designs that look significantly different than our current operating fleet. So I know Neil just looks like he just joined, so I want to make sure we have time with him to talk and we can come back to this. But there has been a lot of momentum and a lot of policies to try to have the NRC think a little bit differently about these new designs, as well as industry is also thinking differently from how they can scale to build not just one or two projects, but hundreds of projects.
Great. So Neil, welcome to the show. Welcome to the conference. Thanks for working with us here with your government technology. The thing that we're trying to work on here, or the thing we've been talking about before you just joined, is if we want to have an abundant energy supply that is also low carbon. The two themes that are emerging from our conversation are the transition from coal to natural gas, which has been happening, and also over the medium to long term, getting nuclear power to be a bigger part of the mix and what the barriers are to there. Now, you at FERC have you've been really at the center of all this. As a guy who hails from coal country in Kentucky, you've really been thinking hard about what do we do to make sure that coal country has a voice in all this. And also you've been thinking a lot about how carbon pricing regimes at the state level can play a role in moving to a more carbon efficient energy market. So floor is yours for the time we've got you for. Neil, tell us what you want to talk about.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and really appreciate the discussion. I have been able to listen in for the last couple of minutes, and I want to echo that, I'm in complete agreement with the comments that have been made thus far. I think the challenges that are facing coal country are very similar to the challenges that are facing the nuclear industry, and that is that these plants are just struggling to compete in a market where we've got incredibly inexpensive gas and increasingly the increased decline in the cost and deployment of renewables. And so at FERC, we're a market regulator. We oversee these markets, and what we're seeing is that it's not regulations or mandates per se that is driving the decline in coal. It's market forces. I point out, Waxman-Markey, which was attempted in the early years of the Obama administration, never passed Congress. The Clean Power Plan was ultimately stayed by the courts. The Paris Climate Accords, President Trump pulled us out, and yet power sector emissions in the U.S. have continued to decline, and that's because of market forces. And I love that quote that we have the rights, the rednecks, and the reserves. It truly is what makes the U.S. unique, but it poses challenges. And so one of the things that we have to consider is what are the impacts of these communities when the coal plants shut down. And that was something that I was greatly sympathetic to early on in my tenure at the commission, when the Department of Energy submitted us under Section 403 a notice of proposed rulemaking to value coal and nuclear plants for having the attribute of on-site fuel. And what I came to recognize as I examined that proposal is that while I'm deeply sympathetic to the plight of coal communities, the area of the country that I grew up in, those are simply not factors that a commission like FERC can evaluate. We've got to make our decisions based on the record before us. And there simply wasn't sufficient legal justification to support the action that DOE had asked us to take. And so we unanimously rejected that proposal. Now, some people find it very interesting that here I am. I'm talking about my concerns about climate change and carbon mitigation, my sympathy for the plight of coal communities. Well, here you've got nuclear power, our single greatest source of baseload carbon-free generation. Yet nuclear plants also are struggling to compete in the competitive markets. And unfortunately, what has happened is a number of states, because nuclear plants are assets that have a lot of political potency, some state legislatures have taken steps to subsidize nuclear generation. And the challenge there is those subsidies are distorting the markets that FERC oversees. They're distorting price signals. So the commission has had to make difficult choices. And one of the tough calls that we made was to put in place a minimum offer price rule in the biggest organized wholesale electric market in the U.S., in the Mid-Atlantic, to basically state that entities have to bid in their true costs and can't value in the subsidy when participating in a competitive auction. And I think that led to a lot of consternation to where we brought us to today, where I think our path out of this is potentially accommodating a price on carbon within FERC jurisdictional markets, pricing the externality as a replacement for the subsidies and the mandates. I actually think that that is a conservative, market protective approach to carbon mitigation. It's something that is favored by the nuclear industry, supported by the gas industry. We have support from renewables as well, and even coal, where there's about a third to maybe half of coal is in competitive markets. They don't love it, but they're not totally opposed to it. We seem to have significant support across the energy industry for this approach, and it could be a viable one going forward.
That's really interesting. So we have a question from Joseph Mycood, which gets to this point of what policy changes would we like to see over the next 4 to 8 years and 4 to 8 years. And what you've suggested here is, well, if you eliminate the wind and solar subsidies, that makes the natural gas and the fossil fuel guys happy. If you have a carbon pricing system, then the renewables and the nuclear guys like that. And if you combine the two, maybe you come up with a system that takes advantage also of the lower cost of traditional sources of energy. So everyone, in a sense, wins a little bit and loses a little bit. Is that the right way to think about the compromise you're conceiving of here?
I prefer to think of it in more market-based terms, that we're allowing the markets to function efficiently, to send the correct price signals. And to me, that is a vastly superior approach than subsidies and mandates that hide costs and distort price signals. And so to me, it's not like a game of trying to placate everybody. It's allowing market forces to work. We've seen thus far over the past couple of decades, markets have a powerful impact in the U.S. They've been beneficial for consumers, for the economy, and for the environment. And so this is what I'm really talking about here, is market protective actions to deal with the realities that in the absence of federal government leadership on carbon mitigation, more and more of these decisions are going to be made at the state level. And I want to make sure that the markets function efficiently in the face of these state decisions. And I actually think this is the smartest, most effective, most efficient way to go about it.
Now, I know you have to go at 4, Neil, so I want to ask you this question. You were recently demoted as a FERC commissioner to being a member of the commission, and you've stated in some venues that you think it's because of this particular carbon pricing plan. Do you have any? You want to talk about that? Tell us your take at this point on what's been going on in these last days of the Trump administration.
Yeah, look, I'll tell you, I think I was far too effective in my prior role. Prior to my serving at the commission, I was a longtime aide to Senator Mitch McConnell, and we fought against the Waxman Markey cap and trade bill. We fought against the EPA Clean Power Plan, and we really resisted and branded a carbon tax or a carbon fee. And I think I was too effective in my role in that regard, because now, as I look to reality, and the reality is that states are going to pursue these policies, whether there's federal action or not, and economists, businesses, all agree that this is actually the conservative market-based approach to dealing with carbon mitigation. Unfortunately, what has happened is the proposal that FERC put forward, which essentially stated that FERC did not have the authority under Section 206 of the Federal Power Act to unilaterally impose a price on carbon, but that should a state implement a price on carbon and that play a role in FERC jurisdictional markets, we could evaluate whether such a proposal was just and reasonable. That's actually a really sensible, conservative, market-based approach. But the headline was Chatterjee from Kentucky pushes carbon tax. And folks gravitated towards the headline without actually digging into the complexity of the issues. And that's partially related to the fact that in my prior role, much to my current consternation, I was way too effective in negatively branding the idea of a price on carbon.
Niko, let me bring you back in here. So what's your take on that? If you had a more carbon pricing based system, how would that affect whether it's traditional nuclear technology or these advanced nuclear technologies?
Unfortunately, that's not an area that I am extremely familiar with. But I think the point of states are making decisions of how to decarbonize, industry companies are making decisions of how to decarbonize, and the challenge is what technologies are going to be able to get them there. And just broadly from ClearPath, focusing on those technologies, whether it's nuclear, carbon capture, geothermal, hydro, those are, I think, the questions that also need to be discussed outside of other policies, because these are the technologies that need to not just decarbonize the electricity sector, but also the industrial and transportation sectors as well. So that's really where my focus is on. Of there are promising technologies, there are promising companies. How can we give them access to the incredible resources at the Department of Energy and the national labs? And how can we thoughtfully have them work together to really demonstrate and alleviate that first of a kind risk, so you can have widespread deployment domestically?
Great. And let's go back to you, Robert, to give us your take on this policy, on what FERC has done in the general concept.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to just ask Niko, and maybe Commissioner Chatterjee has a view on this as well, because I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. I just don't think if we're going to reduce emissions, there's any other pathway, unless we have greater market share for nuclear. But the problems to me are pretty obvious, and that is that electricity demand in the U.S. has been flat for 15 years. I mean, no growth at all, despite population increases. And also that the market is very diffused. We have the most diffused ownership of any electric grid in the world, 3,000 different electric providers, 800 or 900 different co-ops, municipally owned utilities, investor owned utilities. So I guess, what to me would be interesting in terms of I agree with Niko's points about how do we get this technology adopted? But it seems to me that one of the key questions is, what's the size of the reactor that's going to fit the market need? Because if you have a market that isn't growing, you have more players competing for essentially a pie that isn't growing. So then what is going to be that increment of new nuclear generation that makes economic sense? Because I think the idea of, the 1,000 megawatt, 1 gigawatt reactor is they're just too big and too expensive. So I'm just curious, Niko, how do you see that in terms of what's the sweet spot, and who are the companies that are developing the right size reactor?
Yeah, a great question, and goes back to the point I made of what does the market want? What do utilities need? What are they interested in to be able to build? So is it large 1,000 megawatt reactors like we have traditionally operating and under construction today? Is it small modular reactors that are significantly smaller in the tens or hundreds of megawatts? Is it microreactors that are in the single digit megawatts electric? And honestly, it's all of them. It really depends on the end use. There might be cases, maybe not here in the US, but in other countries that are looking to build because they are rapidly growing their electricity demand, that they are interested in 1,000 megawatt electric reactors, and they are interested in US companies and US technologies to build those reactors. There will be other countries that are generally smaller and their grid just can't handle that large of a single source of electricity. So they're going to look for something in the several hundred megawatt electric range. Then there's going to be instances of either remote operation or remote locations, issues for reliability for backup power, where they're going to look at more of those single digit microreactors. And today we have companies working on all of those. We have Oklo, which is designing a microreactor company, microreactor, 1.5 megawatts of electricity. They have an application in with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission today to build a reactor at the Idaho National Lab, but they've also discussed building in places like Alaska, where they rely on diesel power, which is incredibly carbon intensive and also requires, shipping in this every year, versus you can put a reactor there and operate it for 10 years without stopping. You can look at companies like X Energy and TerraPower, which were recently selected by the Department of Energy to demonstrate their reactor designs in the next 7 years. TerraPower is a 345 megawatt electricity that uses molten salt thermal energy storage, so it can kind of increase its capacity or its generation to 500 megawatts for so many hours, 5.5 hours, to kind of give that flexible operation, but also really fit into kind of what the market needs of having that flexibility in operation. X Energy is a 80 megawatt reactor, put 4 on site, so you're kind of in that 300 sweet spot again. And it has that high temperature attributes where it could be used for process heat in addition to electricity. So these are some of the companies that are really looking to build in the near term or actively under review by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And they're trying to find, what does the market want? What does the market need to be able to build their reactors?
We got a question here, Robert, for you from our friend, former Virginia Governor George Allen, who asks, can Robert share with us what's the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity production from facilities powered by natural gas, coal, hydro, nuclear, solar, and onshore and offshore wind, inclusive of capital costs, operational costs, and the transmission costs and the cost of the fuel? I don't know if you have those numbers off the top of your head. I know you've written about this more conceptually at the very least.
Well, I have the broad scope. The offshore wind, if you just consider the EIA's numbers on levelized cost of energy, offshore wind is the most expensive. The last number I saw, and it's not recent, is in the range of $200 a megawatt hour. That's on the wholesale. That's not delivered. And then it goes down from there. Natural gas price. Well, I mean, if we work from the other end, hydro, if all the capital costs are taken care of, then we're talking a penny and a half, 2 cents a kilowatt hour. I know I live in Austin, and you do too, Avik. I know the South Texas project, city of Austin owns 16% of it. They're generating electricity there for 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And it depends on what's inside the fence. What are you including? Are you including the system costs of integrating the renewables into the system, including the costs of transmission? Well, if you
I think that's part of his question.
Right. And if you don't include those costs, then wind energy looks pretty attractive. If you include them, well, it gets more expensive. So, that's always the question. How do you ring fence that number? And I don't have those exact numbers because they're generally not available. I know that here in Texas, the state mandated the building of the CREZ lines from the Panhandle down to the areas, the central part of the state, at a cost of some $5 or $6 billion. That wasn't paid for by the wind companies; it was paid for by ratepayers.
Governor Allen has an artful way of asking a leading question, and Diana Furchtgott-Roth, who's also here with us, has asked the explicit question, which is, well, how a carbon pricing regime or a carbon tax regime only works if you price things correctly. And it seems to me, and I think this is the thrust of Governor Allen's question, you can't price it correctly unless you're taking into account all those costs, not merely the cost of generation, the capital cost, the cost of transmission, everything else. And I suppose then the point is, can we have confidence that those decisions will be made in a non-political way? in a way that is actually fair to each faction of the energy pie.
Well, and the other question is, and has been much talked about, but I'm very skeptical about is, if we just pass the carbon tax, then we'll be able to repeal all these other local and state measures then that are distorting the market, as Commissioner Chatterjee talked about. I'm very skeptical about that. I'm skeptical of carbon taxation just on its political viability, but also the idea that we're going to pass a carbon tax in the U.S. and then have some cross-border adjustment to harmonize imports and exports based on some kind of carbon fee. I don't know that would pass international trade rules, and I think it would be devilishly difficult to implement. And I mean, as I've told you, Avik, we don't have an international agreement to ban landmines. I don't see how we're going to find one to levy a tax on carbon. And then the other challenge, of course, is getting the right number. So I understand the political arguments of why it's needed. And I know that the gas industry, the gas-fired generators, and the nuclear industry are definitely in favor. And I understand why. I just, from a political basis, I see it as a very difficult challenge.
We have another question related to this very lively topic of carbon pricing, carbon taxing, which is, as you alluded to, Robert, one concern about carbon pricing is if it's done perhaps the wrong way, it could lead to higher energy prices, which of course affects lower income people. Conceptually speaking, leaving aside, bad actors or people who design things poorly, is there a way to design a carbon pricing market such that it's not regressive, so that the cost of energy for lower income people is still in the range we'd want it to be?
Well, that's the promise of what do they call it, the tax and rebate program, right? Which I think is the Baker-Schultz idea that from James Baker and George Shultz put forward. We'll have a tax and dividend, I think was the term they used, that will place a tax on carbon federally, and then we'll rebate it in the forms of lower employment taxes or sending people a check. Which, sounds good in theory, but again, the devil's in the details. And I could see this, what we saw in Washington State when they implemented or tried to pass a carbon tax. It was convenient that the aircraft manufacturer, Boeing, was exempted, right? And so I've just, my first book was on Enron. So, when it comes to these kinds of ideas of, we're going to trade carbon, or we're going to implement carbon taxes, and we're going to, I'm just incurably skeptical about it.
Niko, this whole thing about if you close the nuclear plants in California, New York, and other places, presumably, just the way I would think of economics as a naive dilettante here is if you reduce the supply of energy, prices should go up. Now, it sounds like what I hear both of you saying, though, is if you actually bring on more nuclear supply and the prices go down a lot, that's bad for the energy market. I guess because the prices, if they're too low, people won't want to supply the energy. Can you help us work through that conundrum? Like, we want energy to be as affordable as possible, but obviously we need the energy suppliers to remain in the market. How does nuclear power fit into that puzzle, and does it disrupt it in a way that's concerning, or is it an opportunity?
It's a great question. I think part of that is really looking at, again, what is the different end uses? Is it strictly electricity? How is nuclear able to complement other energy sources that are on the grid? So it can also remain competitive as well as other energy sources. Is it looking at other industries that might have kind of higher costs and it's harder to decarbonize without some other technological breakthroughs? So it is really looking, I think, at those different questions of what makes the most sense to be cost competitive, still be profitable, and kind of check all of those boxes, which would be true for any energy source that is under consideration to be built.
One thing, Robert, that you mentioned earlier, just in your opening comments, that we have a question that relates to, which is, you mentioned that demand for electricity is flat, which is actually very interesting. If we end up having a mass electrification of the automobile sector and other related sectors, and therefore a massive drop in demand for crude oil transportation energy, what does that do to overall demand? Obviously, it would reduce carbon emissions, but how would that affect energy markets?
Well, this is one of the key questions, and I've been looking closely at California because obviously they're in the vanguard on a lot of these issues. And Southern California Edison recently published some estimates that electrifying transportation in California alone would add about 100 terawatt hours of new demand per year to the grid in California. Well, the first reaction, of course, is they can't handle the load they have now. They're having blackouts now. So why would you add 100 terawatt hours, which is 45 or 50% more than the existing demand? So to me, the concern there, and in other states, New Jersey has put out their net zero plan to achieve net zero by 2050. And if you dig into the appendix, you see they're projecting a doubling of electricity demand in that state because of this push for mandatory or forced electrification. Many people call it beneficial, but it's really forced electrification. Well, 100% increase in electricity demand means you have to add enormous amounts of wires, transformers, poles, generators, all these things to the grid. And who pays for that? All of that is going to be rate based. And I think that ultimately, again, is the broader concern that I have about these efforts, is that the poor and the middle class are going to disproportionately pay for that. And that's a real concern. And I haven't seen much attention at all paid to that part of the story. How are we going to make an equitable cost share on this for people who don't drive Teslas, but they're going to be required to pay for the public charging stations that are needed to recharge the Teslas?
Yeah, you reminded me of something I know you've written about California, which is that Gavin Newsom's policy regime is we want everyone to drive electric cars, but we don't actually want to supply the electricity that can charge the cars. So that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, and seems like a train wreck in slow motion about to happen. But as you point out, I guess I should have asked the question a little differently. Actually, it's electricity demand we should expect to actually go up if we go to if we have a mass transition from fossil fuel powered cars, gas powered cars to electric cars.
And the same is true with natural gas bans. So we would be putting yet more load on the grid because of the residential natural gas consumption, commercial natural gas consumption, that would be part of the electrification effort as well. So we're looking at significant increases in electricity demand if these things do come into play. And if that's the case, the only way that I believe we can keep CO2 emissions relatively stable is with new nuclear, because the other part of the work that I've been doing and following now for 10 years are the land use conflicts around renewables. This idea that, we're going to produce green hydrogen and we're going to electrolyze water and we're going to do it all with all this excess renewable energy. You can't build wind energy new capacity in California. In New York, it's probably the epicenter of the backlash against wind energy in America. It's very difficult to build new wind. So all of these things are coming together. And again, I think the battleground, the grid is the battleground.
Another thing.
Robert,
go ahead, Niko.
I was going to say, I completely agree with Robert on that. And the energy density of nuclear is definitely one of its most appealing attributes, where if you can build multiple facilities on one site and provide that much more electricity. If we were talking about kind of coal, if you can take a coal facility that is shut down and put a small modular reactor there, which has a similar amount of output, or you could put multiple ones there, you have a lot of that existing grid infrastructure right there on site that you could take advantage of without having to build new transmission or new facilities. So I think it'll require a lot of creativity of how we really look at building a lot of new capacity if that need arises based on decarbonization goals from states and companies. And that's really where these new plants, because of their smaller footprint and their energy density that is just inherent to the technology, can really fit within a decarbonized grid.
Yeah, the point that you're both making. Go ahead, Robert.
Just add to that point with what Niko made, because it's absolutely essential, is that the transmission capacity that would be needed to accommodate a huge expansion of renewables, particularly wind, it's just a gargantuan number. NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, I think in 2012 estimated it would require doubling high voltage transmission capacity. So Niko's point is very well taken, that if we can, in fact, Rod Adams, I had him on the Power Hungry podcast, we're going to air that episode pretty soon. He said, this is where nuclear can really play in the market, because you can put it as Niko said, on sites that already have high voltage transmission there. you can put it wherever you need it. Wind has to go, out there, in rural areas that are windy. Nuclear plants can be put pretty much anywhere.
I want to just kind of reiterate and hammer home this point, because it's something that you both talk about a lot, but may not be necessarily well known to the audience, which is part of the challenge with wind and solar is that the amount of land it takes, because they're not energy dense, the amount of land it takes and infrastructure it takes to collect that energy and transmit it is massive and impractical. And it's just hard to see how we get to a low carbon energy supply through wind and solar, whereas nuclear is the opposite, is incredibly generative of power in a very small amount of surface area. That's really the promise and the excitement, if anything, of these advanced nuclear technologies that we're now beginning to see. And the transmission piece is also obviously really important. Again, just to summarize what you both are saying, that you're going to have to build these massive power lines, and a lot of people don't like having power lines, over their properties. So that becomes a huge fight that a lot of people don't appreciate. We got a question here from the audience on what happens to the oil and gas majors if this. Whether it's nuclear or whether it's a wind and solar regime or some combination thereof, or maybe it's natural gas, I don't know. But if companies like ExxonMobil, I think of the majors as spending a lot of time investing in alternative energy. But you guys tell me, what's the fate of the oil and gas majors in a world in which nuclear and other sources are driving energy supply?
Oh, go ahead, Niko.
We at ClearPath also work on carbon capture, which I think is a great example where there are going to be processes that will still require oil and gas. And the question is, if we're going to zero emissions, how can carbon capture be a part of that conversation? Something with nuclear, as mentioned with the high temperature process heat, would an oil and gas company, in order to lower its kind of cumulative emissions, use nuclear technology to provide some of that process heat in some of its chemical refineries? So I think there's a couple other questions where, at least on nuclear, could fit in with that, but also broadly for ClearPath, why we look at other technologies like carbon capture, which I do not work on, but there are multiple technologies that are going to be needed for us to reach something that looks like zero emissions.
Tell us a little bit more about that. For people who aren't familiar with carbon capture technologies, how does it work to capture carbon dioxide effectively and store it somewhere else other than the atmosphere?
Say my high level answer will be, you can say you have a natural gas generator, you can capture the carbon that's being produced at that site, and you can store it for either uses otherwise, such as enhanced oil recovery. You can bury it or store it elsewhere. And so there's a couple different ways you can do it. I'm definitely not the technical expert to talk on carbon capture, so I'll be curious if Robert has any other thoughts he would like to share either.
No, I think you covered it pretty well there, Niko. And just back to the oil question, I'm a contrarian there. I think oil's here to stay. The energy density of oil is almost miraculous. It's, there's this idea, there's a conspiracy, and GM and Ford bought up all the patents for the great batteries. Well, the conspiracy is basic math and simple physics. The energy density of gasoline, it's 125,000 BTUs per gallon. The energy density is something like 80 times the energy density of the best lithium ion battery. So even if you assume a double efficiency in electric vehicles over internal combustion, you're still at 40x. But one other thing that I think is important about the electrification of transportation, and why I think that oil is going to be here for a long time to come, is that this idea that we're going to electrify mass segments of the transportation fleet depends on this assumption that we're going to have all the available copper, all the available lithium, all the available rare earth elements, dysprosium, lanthanum, neodymium, all of these things that go into a Prius that people don't think about. And who controls the market for those commodities and as well as cobalt? It's largely the Chinese. So this idea that suddenly, we'll reduce our CO2 emissions because we're all going to be driving electric cars, I just simply don't believe it. The Otto cycle engine, the diesel cycle engine, they are the pinnacle of modern technology, and they've gotten better and more powerful, cleaner over more than a century of development. So I think it's far too early to say the what is it, the eulogy for ExxonMobil or the other oil industry, other oil producers. I think oil and gas, even more than oil, I think natural gas has a lot of runway left here in the U.S. and around the world.
Does carbon capture technology, if it were applied to the places where it would need to be applied, would that significantly drive up the cost of energy, or would that be something you could apply, with minimal distortion energy markets?
Say, like a lot of these technologies that we're working on, nuclear, the goal is getting the cost down. So as Robert's been talking about, how does it not unfairly increase costs to the consumer? How does it still meet the decarbonization goals? And that's really where a lot of these technologies do rely on the private investments, the research and development, and those technical capabilities of the national labs and the DOE to help get those costs down so they can be competitive in the market. And that's really where the goal needs to be on a lot of these projects, is trying to get it to a point where if a company is interested in decarbonization, they have options to do that. And they have options to do that cost competitively and on the time scale that they need.
Let's talk about the politics for a minute here, if we could. We just had this big election. One of the most interesting things about the election was Trump's performance relative to Biden in the border counties of Texas that border Mexico. And a big part of the driver, if you talk to the voters, as a number of journalists do, is that the energy industry is a big employer in South Texas. And they were not happy with Joe Biden saying that he was going to transition their industry into oblivion. I know, Robert, you wrote a piece for Forbes recently about the Latino activists in California who've been raising hell about some of the environmental policies in California. Tell us a little bit more about that and how that's been going.
Sure. It's one of the most interesting political battles that I've seen in 30 years of being in journalism, is that you have in California the left attacking the left, or the left attacking the lefter. But it's the Latino leaders in California, under a group called the 200, led by a very sharp lawyer at Holland and Knight named Jennifer Hernandez, have filed 3 different lawsuits against the state of California, arguing that the most, if not all, of the climate policies that the state is promoting are regressive taxation, a form of regressive taxation, with the most regressive being this vehicle miles traveled rule that was not voted on by the legislature. But these are very the litigation. You can find the piece on Forbes or on my website, robertbryce.com, or on, I think, on FREOPP's website. But that you can get a link to the complaint, and it's fascinating reading about the Latino leaders pointing out California has the highest poverty rate in America, and it has also some of the highest energy costs. And these regulations are going to make those energy costs and housing and transportation all more expensive. So if California is in the vanguard on pushing for net zero and so on, I think it's potentially a harbinger of more to come in terms of minority groups saying, hey, wait a minute, we want a clean environment, we want action on climate, but you're imposing these regressive taxes that are going to keep us poor.
Yeah, very interesting. What do how do you observe the politics of energy right now, Niko? Tell us your take.
Yeah, I think there has been, over the past Congress, specifically on nuclear, a lot of bipartisan support for it. And there have been significant projects that have started over the past Congress, from kind of pieces of legislation, actually over the past 2 Congresses, the Nuclear Energy Innovation Modernization Act, which was really focused on kind of regulatory updates. So going back to what initially asked of what can the NRC, or what does the NRC need to do to be able to build these new technologies, ensure their safety in accordance with the NRC's mission, but also make sure they can be rapidly deployed. There's been other legislation specifically focused on kind of the research and development. We're trying to build a new test reactor here, the versatile test reactor in the US, which would give a capability that is only available right now in Russia. So that will be critically important for kind of maybe not this first wave of advanced reactor technologies, but the next wave, who are trying to go to higher temperatures, new materials, more aggressive environments to operate in, where you need to prove out and test those technologies. And then this week, another major piece of nuclear legislation was introduced, again, bipartisan, where it's looking at kind of continued modernization for the NRC, international aspects where other countries have growing electricity demand. Other countries want to decarbonize. They look to nuclear. And right now, the countries primarily building and exporting nuclear are China and Russia. So if they would like to partner and work with the US and build US technologies, I mean, that is a 60 to 80 to 100-year relationship between countries for these designs, from initial planning to building to operation, and having a 60+ year lifetime for a reactor. So there's been a lot of bipartisan support, a lot of major programs that have started. Again, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program with TerraPower and X-Energy. So the question is going to be, how can the next Congress, how can the next administration support these projects, continue supporting them to make sure they can be completed? How would you look broadly and internationally? And there was a lot of work was done from the previous administration and previous Congress on looking at nuclear and how it can be a tool for not just the US, but also internationally.
So, I mean, what it sounds like I hear you saying, Niko, is that, you know, if you think about the mid 20th century when there was so much politics around nuclear energy, there still are obviously a lot of political concerns or resistance to nuclear energy, but it seems like it's getting less political, that there is emerging a consensus around the need to advance nuclear technology in order to address the combined problems of, we need energy and we want that energy to be of low carbon emission quality or carbon efficiency.
Yep, agreed.
And I think
one quick last question.
Sure.
Go ahead, Robert.
Well, I just think that bipartisan action on nuclear is long overdue, frankly, and it's been one that has taken decades. A friend of mine at DOE a long time ago told me, he said, the problem with nuclear is that Democrats are anti-nuclear and pro-government. Republicans are pro-nuclear and anti-government. We need politicians who are pro-government and pro-nuclear, because you have to have government support. You have to have that, or the regulatory regime, and that is critical. And I think the NRC has that stamp, of the gold stamp, right? In terms of, as Niko said, if we're going to export this technology, we need strong government motivation behind it. And I think, you know, for the first time in 48 years, the Democrats in their party platform said, we're pro-nuclear. So now, if they're going to be in power, we're going to find out pretty quickly about just exactly how pro-nuclear they are.
That was a very interesting piece of the Biden platform. We got one last question, and then we'll wrap up here, about biomass and biofuels. One of our questioners says those are featured in Michael Moore's new movie, Planet of the Humans. Either of you have any thoughts on the practicality of biomass and biofuels? Our questioner says that he found the arguments compelling, that we've got some opportunity there.
Hey, Robert.
Well, how much time do we have? Because I've written a whole book on the problems with biomass and biofuels. The fundamental problem is low power density. We've been talking about power density for some time. Nuclear power has, at Indian Point in New York, 2,000 watts per square meter. Solar is about 10 watts per square meter. Wind energy, I don't care where you put it, is 1 watt per square meter. Biofuels, again, it doesn't matter what kind of biofuel, whether it's liquid or trying to turn it into electricity, you're talking fractions of a watt per square meter. So there are very few places where you can use biomass to produce electricity. On the island of Kauai in Hawaii is one of them. But I think generally speaking, the idea is that we're going to fuel a modern economy that uses globally over 250 million barrels of oil equivalent per day, and we're going to use biomass to get there. It's just not viable on any kind of scale.
Well, if that's the pessimistic note, the optimistic note is we're actually making enormous progress on nuclear energy. We're making enormous progress in reducing carbon emissions through organic market evolution. And stay tuned. I think it's going to be a really interesting 5 years in energy policy. So I want to thank Robert Bryce from FREOPP, Niko McMurray from ClearPath, and Neil Chatterjee of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for being with us today. You've been watching Agenda 2025, FREOPP's conference on an equal opportunity agenda for the president inaugurated in 2025. Our last session of this conference will be tomorrow, also at 3:30 Eastern. The same Zoom URL link you used to log in today will work for that session. We look forward to seeing you then. It will be on the politics of inclusion, how we get both parties to compete for every vote in this country. You won't want to miss it. It's going to be an incredible lineup. Thanks so much for being here today. See you tomorrow.